coming home, I'm coming home. Tell the world I'm coming.
Imagine an empire at the absolute peak of its power. Bursting granaries, glittering palaces, armies stretching to the horizon. And now imagine that this exact moment of maximum glory is also the moment its clock of destruction begins ticking. Because this is the secret a 14th century North African scholar named Ibn Khaldun uncovered centuries before. Economists had the vocabulary for boom and bust, and the key to his theory is one untranslatable word: Asabiyyah, roughly social cohesion, the raw solidarity and shared hunger that lets a small, hardened group claw its way to power. Think desert tribesmen, hardened by scarcity, bound by mutual need, who topple soft, complacent dynasties precisely because those dynasties have lost their edge. And here is where Ibn Khaldun's genius shows itself, because he didn't just describe the rise, he mapped the fall with almost mathematical precision. The very conquerors who seize power through unity immediately begin, generation by generation, to dissolve that unity, because their children are born into comfort rather than struggle. And by the third or fourth generation, the ruling class has transformed from lean warriors into a bloated, parasitic elite obsessed with luxury and status, rather than the hard work of governing. And this isn't merely moral decline, it's an economic mechanism with brutal consequences, because a parasitic elite is an expensive elite, and to fund their palaces and festivals, rulers do what every declining state eventually does: raise taxes. And here Ibn Khaldun makes an observation sharp enough to belong in a modern economics textbook. He argued low taxes produce the greatest revenue because they leave people the incentive to work and trade. But as the elite's appetite grows, taxes climb past an invisible threshold, and beyond it, revenue actually starts falling, because a crushed population simply stops producing. Merchants close shops, farmers plant less, investment dries up, and the engine that funded the empire's glory begins to seize. This is essentially the Laffer curve, articulated 600 years before an American economist sketched it on a napkin. And Ibn Khaldun saw it not as an abstract graph, but as the literal heartbeat of civilizational death. Because as revenue shrinks, the elite doesn't reform, it doubles down, debasing currency, borrowing against the future, extracting every last coin from an economy that can no longer bear it. And this is exactly the moment a state becomes fatally vulnerable, not when it's poor, but when it's exhausted, hollowed out by its own success. And it's precisely then that a hungrier, more cohesive rival delivers the final blow. Not because they're stronger in any absolute sense, but because the old order has already consumed itself from within. And Ibn Khaldun even gave this cycle a rough shelf life, rarely stretching past 3 or 4 generations before the rot turns terminal. Which raises an uncomfortable question: where are we today on this exact curve? Look at the modern world and the parallels are hard to ignore. Advanced economies drowning in sovereign debt that no longer funds growth but simply services old debt. Tax systems so heavy that entire industries exist just to help capital escape them. Political classes detached from the productive base of their societies while manufacturing hollows out and populations grow quietly exhausted, and central banks endlessly manufacturing currency and debt to paper over the gap between what governments promise and what economies can actually produce. This isn't a partisan observation, it's a structural one, because Ibn Khaldun's model doesn't care about ideology, it cares about incentives and the brutal arithmetic of extraction versus production. And zoom out geopolitically, and you see the same pattern between nations, as hungrier, more cohesive rising powers wait on the periphery, while older, wealthier, more fractured powers spend down their advantage on internal disputes rather than external strength. And history's verdict is consistent. No civilization has ever taxed or borrowed its way out of the Asabiyyah problem, because the crisis was never really fiscal, it was social. A loss of shared purpose and shared stake, replaced by a widening gap between an insulated elite and an extracted majority. And so the real question isn't whether the next crisis is a debt crisis or a banking crisis, because those are only symptoms, but whether we can rebuild the kind of genuine cohesion that once let hungry outsiders build something powerful in the first place. Because if Ibn Khaldun's 600-year-old warning holds true, the societies that survive won't be the ones with the deepest pockets, but the ones that remember how to pull together before the bill finally comes due.